When I think about Jim, I think back to my childhood memories, and most of them revolve around camping outdoors with Jim and Laurie and my cousins, playing in streams, running through the forest, playing hide and seek. And I think a lot of you probably have similar memories of Jim being the adventurous outdoorsman that he was. And so when writing this, I was searching for something that I thought would be appropriate, a poem that I just felt like he might enjoy. So I'm going to share this poem that I found with y'all. Here it goes. So, you do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees or 100 miles through the desert repenting. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of rain are moving across landscapes, over the prairies and in the deep trees, in the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clear blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, the world offers itself to your imagination. Calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting over and over, announcing your place in the family of life. So, on that opening at this time, I'd like to invite the family, Andy Theiler, to come up and say a prayer.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hello, Andy. I want to thank you guys all for coming out, and thank you for your condolences and your cards and your prayers. It's really been appreciated. So I'd like to start today off with a prayer, and then we will continue on. So get you guys quiet and bow our heads. Dear Heavenly Father, I come before you today in this celebration of life for Jim. And I thank you, dear Lord, for loving us and choosing us. And I ask that you would just wrap yourself around us to comfort us and guide us through this time. We're so thankful for the time that we'd spent with Jim and the memories that will last forever. Also, I ask that you would just bless us and keep us safe in all of our travels. And let us remember that in all we do for the glory of God. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
So, my siblings asked me to give a eulogy, and I have to say it's a really great honor to do that. But I also have to tell you that this is not the eulogy. My dad lived a long, full, deep, interesting life, and there's no way I could summarize the whole thing. I wouldn't even know where to begin. Back in Rangoon in 02. Louisville in 39. He touched a lot of people, all of you, and many people besides. He affected so many people, every one of them is going to have their own stories and their own memories. And today I'm just going to talk about some of my own stories and memories and impressions of my dad, starting in Albuquerque in 64 or so. And I'm going to warn you ahead of time, actually it's quite a few stories. Young kid, I totally idolized my father as a father, but I totally idolized him as a race car driver. I used to go to see him in his red number 8 at Speedway Park every Saturday night. My aunts Marilyn and Nancy would take me, and I lived for those nights. The cool air, the sound of the engines, the skidding around the curves. It's very exciting. I think most of you have heard this story, and Dad told it all the time, but I was there, and I can tell you it's true, it really happened. So my dad was racing. I think it might have been a trophy dash, but not that that matters. And the car spun out, and to get his car off the track, he had to sort of go against traffic for about a quarter of a lap or so. And while I was doing that, I remember looking down at the track and then looking at my aunts and saying, why are all those other cars going the wrong way? My dad could do no wrong. I learned a lot from my dad. He had an incredible work ethic. He wasn't really into reading books or watching TV or going to movies. He always had to be doing things, building things, fixing things. It was like a superpower. He could fix anything. And remember, he could fix this without the benefit of YouTube. And the Chilton Manual was his YouTube. And if he said he was going to do something, he would do it. And whenever he did something, he did it right. And if somebody else asked him to do something, he would usually do that too. I don't believe he ever said no to a genuine request for help. As kids, he told us no all the time. In the mid-1960s, so a lot of you probably remember, UNM actually had a great basketball team, nationally ranked, the Lobos. And occasionally, very occasionally, my dad would watch a game with us on TV. And I have two sort of really specific memories of that time. And one of them was just how much he hated what he called stall ball. He just said it with such a tone in his voice. And that's the team who's ahead, just sort of really tries to take extra long to try and run out the clock. And back in the 60s, you could actually do that for quite a while. You could just take as much time as you wanted. At the time, I thought he just sort of opposed the strategy. Like he didn't think it was an effective way to work. But looking back, he just viscerally hated the whole concept of stalling. His whole philosophy of life was, if you have the ball, you do something with it. If you have a life, you do something with it. The second thing I remember was one time, it was a Lobo game. The Lobos lost. It was a close game, and there's sort of an arguably questionable referee call at the end. And my dad didn't actually watch that game, but I just finished watching it. And I was telling him about it and kind of complaining about the call. And he sort of became philosophical, as he often did. And he says, I know some guys, they lose a race and they say there was too much mud on the track, or, my mechanic didn't really tune my engine right. Basically, he didn't have much patience for the sort of woulda, coulda, shoulda, and even less patience for blaming other people for your own misfortune. And I also remember, I think part of the reason I remember that so much is I sort of felt really embarrassed at the time because my whining about the referee was sort of not only petty, but it was also putting me in the same category as those race car drivers who were not my dad. And more than anything else in the world, I wanted to be in the same category as my dad. I remember I had a little toy car, and I could sort of just get inside it and kind of push it along the sidewalk. And I liked it pretty much. But I also remember that my dad sort of had this thing that's very complicated. He had all this masking tape and a razor blade. He cut these things out with a razor blade, and then he painted it on. And I couldn't even quite figure what was going on. I was just a little kid. And then finally he pulled the masking tape up, and there was this sort of this number 8, and sort of clean and neat and official looking. And then I loved the car. And that's just how my dad did things. I would have been happy to just sort of take a spray can and just write a number 8 on it. A little slapdash hand-painted number would have been fine, but slapdash was not the way my dad did things. And actually, I was driving another car. This was many, many years later. I was in graduate school. It was a Chevrolet Impala, which my dad had wrangled for me. And which is a great car for school because it was big. And whenever we went out for pizza or some other outing, I could volunteer space in my car for 5 other passengers, 6 in a pinch. And they'd all have to listen to my cassettes. And that's a car I owned actually when we got married. And someone had decorated with some paper stuff and a just married sign. And as we were driving back, we got approving honks from all the lowriders in Los Angeles. It was an old car, and at one point the drive shaft was going out. And so I'm on the phone with my dad asking him what I should do. And what ended up happening is he ended up actually going to a junkyard in Albuquerque and finding me an appropriate drive shaft and mailing it to me in Pasadena. And when the package arrived, it was sort of oddly shaped and really long. We're talking Chevy Impala here. And it totally impressed my roommates, Michael and Brian and Betty. And of course, my dad also sent point-by-point instructions, so I was able to install it. It worked great. And I remember Betty's mom just thought I must be some kind of spoiled rich kid. His dad just sent him parts in the mail. And I wasn't all that rich at the time, but she's right, I was pretty spoiled. So even when I was little, my dad always referred to himself as the old man. You often heard him call himself that. But even when he was young, he called himself the old man. And I could never bring myself to call him that, just because I was too much in awe of him. And so for the first 12 years of my life, I listened to every word he said. And I also remember, sort of about the time, so just as I was becoming a teenager, I still remember the first time I realized I might have a different opinion from him. And what I remember is it kind of caught me by surprise. I wasn't expecting that. He was just always right. And so I also remember the first time I actually expressed a different opinion to him. And it was probably something I read in the newspaper, teacher at school had suggested to me or something. And his response was, well, to an extent. And that's another classic dadism. And so it obviously wasn't enough of an extent for him to change his mind, but I appreciated that he acknowledged that I had a point. And in the process, I learned a quick trick for disagreeing without being disagreeable. And my dad was not disagreeable. As I was growing up, and especially as sort of becoming an awkward teenager, I was just always amazed by, and more than a little jealous of, how easy he was with people, how charming he was with strangers, how confident he was in his own skin, how his blue eyes would twinkle. Anyway, whenever I had like an interview coming up or a presentation to give, I would just always say to myself, hey, just turn on that Theiler charm. And I don't know if that ever worked for me, but it might have, because I see that Theiler charm in all of my brothers and sisters. It's just really clear. I really admire it. I say he wasn't much of a book reader, but that's not entirely true. So I remember when he decided to get his GED, he hadn't graduated from high school, and about the time I was 10 or 12, he sort of decided he should get his GED. And he actually reminded me of that time, last time I talked to him, just about a month ago when he was in the hospital. And I had mentioned that my son Sky was in Berkeley right now, we're finishing up his degree. And when I mentioned that, my dad told me, sort of for the millionth time, how important education was. Education, that's important. And it's a phrase he really meant. And I know that he was always a big supporter of my own education. I went to MIT, which was a fairly expensive school, and we didn't have a lot of money, and I remember him just saying, we'll make it work. And it worked. Anyway, when he was talking about getting his GED, he talked about sort of how much he enjoyed it. And I'm not sure exactly why he decided to get his GED. I don't know if there was some professional advantage, something at work. But I do know that he really thought education was important, and I know he didn't like to leave things unfinished. So he may originally have done it just because he felt like he ought to do it. But I think it surprised him a little bit how much he actually liked it. One of his school projects was researching the law and the practice of retirement plans. And he was very interested in sort of how they were set up, and he read a lot about them. And had a sort of very specific and very fond memory of going to the public library with him, and with me sort of checking out the math books, as I was doing at the time, and him finding books and magazine articles about retirement plans. And this was at night, of course, because he still had a full-time day job to hold down and a family to support. Anyway, in his early 60s, he finally got to put his research into practice, and he retired. I think it took him a few years to settle in. There were a couple of money issues and a little bit of work at Magnus, but when he finally really got into it, I think he just totally did. He became a total evangelist for the concept of retirement. So even when Betty and I were in our sort of late 40s, he was, every time we'd see him, he'd keep asking us, when do you guys plan to retire? And another fond memory I have, once he retired, was going to the museum, the Natural History Museum, with Laurie and him and AJ and Nikki. And I particularly remember going into sort of creepy crawly room. That was a big hit with the girls, and not so much with my dad. But he was always telling us stories about what AJ and Nikki had said and done. what Danny was up to and what Lisa was doing, and talking about his latest trip to Alaska. One regret I actually have is I never managed to make that trip to Alaska with him. He totally loved those trips. But as he got older, and the macular degeneration and some health issues came up, he couldn't make that drive anymore. He slowed down a little bit in his outdoor activities. And I think as this happened, he sort of really embraced his role as like a family man, the family patriarch, as Grandpa Jim. And when I was a kid, my father could do no wrong. Now when he talked about his kids and his grandkids with such love and admiration, as far as he was concerned, they could do no wrong. Every birthday and every anniversary, Dad would call to wish us a happy one. I think his calendar gets some credit for that. And to tell Betty that her favorite father-in-law was calling and to ask when we were next visiting Albuquerque.
And when we were going to retire.
And once again, when are we going to retire? Okay, so I have one more story, and it's a story that he told me quite recently. I just happened to be talking about walking the dog and taking these long hikes, and he said, do you take your wallet when you go on these long hikes? And then he just launched into this story that I'd never heard before. He wanted to ride some guy's motorcycle, and I guess the guy was a little nervous about him doing that, so Dad just took the wallet out of his pocket and tossed it to the guy, and got on the motorcycle and took off. So it was like, it's collateral. And of course, crashed the motorcycle. And I guess it was quite a crash because they took him to the hospital and he was unconscious. And he didn't have ID, so they didn't know who he was. So meanwhile, this motorcycle guy thought that my dad had stolen his motorcycle, and so he gave the wallet to the police. And in Dad's telling of the story, it sort of took the cops quite a while to realize that these two cases were related. The reason I bring this story up, what amazed me about this story is that I had never heard it before. My dad's been telling me the same stories over and over again since 50 years, and I never heard that one. And I just sort of wonder how many more stories there are that I haven't heard. And I'm hoping some of you will step in and fill that gap. My dad lived a long, full, rich, interesting, and sometimes complicated life. As Lisa said, no one was more alive than him. So I feel like I'm also living a rich and interesting life, and I owe so much of that to what I learned from my dad, from the crazy stuff he told me, the incredible example he provided. I love you, Dad, and I'll miss the old man.
I was Jim's hunting partner for 40 years. That's 4 decades. I mean, it was a long time, and in that time, I really got to respect and look at Jim as being one of my better friends. When I graduated from school down in Las Cruces, I moved back to Albuquerque, and the girl that I was dating, who became my wife, I was telling her, I said, I'd like to get back into hunting because I grew up here in town. And she said, well, I've got family that hunts, and why don't you let me give them a call? And I'm thinking, okay, that's a pretty good deal. But what you have to understand is when you invite somebody into your hunting camp and you go hunt, you don't know what you're going to get. I mean, seriously, you don't know if you're going to get a raging alcoholic or you're going to get a guy that doesn't pitch in on camp chores. I mean, you get somebody out there that you don't get along with, and generally those type of hunts become 2 hunts, the first and the last. So anyway, my wife called and Jim graciously said yes, and little did I know that hunt that he and his son Andy and I went on up above Pecos, New Mexico, started that 40-year hunting career as a great friend of mine. In those years when we were together, and we'd be stuck in the camper because of the snowstorms, and we'd be stuck in the, in the fifth wheels and the stuff because the weather was so bad you couldn't get out. You really ended up sharing a lot of things with people that you spent a lot of time with, and that was certainly the case with Jim and I. We talk about family. We talk about friends. We talk about things in our life that we wish we could have had a do-over. You know, we could have done them over again, or we could have tried to do them right, or have them turn out differently. And in that, we also were able to talk about the things that really brought a lot of joy in our life, and that was kids and grandkids. And in that included a lot of hunting stories. And if you ever understood about being around a campfire on a hunting story at the night, it's kind of like you start telling on yourself, knowing that you're going to be the brunt of the joke, but it's because you share so much with somebody, you just end up having that type of relationship that it's okay. You can do that kind of thing. And that's really what happened between Jim and I. The more time we spent together, the more stories, especially he would tell. And for the first 3 or 4 years that he and I hunted together, he'd tell me these stories that were going on. By the way, James, I heard the story about the motorcycle. If you ever want to know anything that you think you might have left out, let me know. I've heard. But I'm just telling you, we'd share stories, and they were always hunting and fishing and camping and that kind of stuff. And the interesting thing about that, I'd hear these stories probably every 3 or 4 years, and then all of a sudden there would be some more stories for the next 3 or 4 years, but they were like the first stories that I heard the first 3 or 4 years. And it got to be that I understood they were the same stories, and I got to hear them so many times I could tell them better than your dad could. That's the truth. But of course, when I talked to Laurie about this, and she said this was to be a celebration of life, I thought, you know, the best way to really present Jim's life is through the stories that he told me. And they're funny stories, they're stories that touch my heart, and I, you know, even to this day I still remember them. And the first one I'd like to share with you is a story that he and I took on a deer hunt up above Cuba, New Mexico. And for one reason or another, I can't remember why, but he ended up going up ahead of me. We did travel up together. So Jim gets up there and he sets up camp, and I show up, you know, 4 or 5 hours later. And I told him, I said, you know, Jim, I haven't had a chance to shoot this gun. I said, I don't know where to shoot, and I don't want to go hunting not knowing, you know, that I can at least hit something. He says, don't worry about that. I got that taken care of. So he goes into this was back when he had the camper, and he goes back into the camper, and he brings out a paper plate, and he drew a little tiny deer picture on there, and he said, let's see if we can get this. So he walked out there about 150 yards, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh. But it's okay. So Jim walks back after he sets that on the tree, and he sets over to my right, and he says, okay, now go ahead. So I took the gun, my hunting rifle, and I laid it on the hood of the car, and I was down trying to get it to where I could see that paper plate and get the target. And I said, Jim, I can't get comfortable on this thing. And he said, I got that covered too. So we went back into the camper, and he brought out this furniture pillow. Now, I don't know the story on the furniture pillow, Laurie, but he told me that he needed it for when he was driving back and forth, but I'm not so sure it wasn't for hemorrhoids or something, but he didn't tell me. I don't even know. So anyway, he hands me this pillow, and he says, take the pillow, put it on the front of the hood, lay your gun barrel on there, and you can get a better rest, and you can take a shot. And I thought, okay, that worked out pretty good. So Jim goes and sits back down on the right side, and I'm aiming through here, and I'm going, oh, you know, I can see that paper plate, and I can see that little deer. So I got comfortable on this thing, and I said, okay, I'm ready to take a shot. He said, okay, go ahead. So I pulled the trigger, and the next thing I know is that there is feathers floating all in the air. I mean, they were just scattered all over. And what had happened is I put the barrel of that gun down in the pillow, and I didn't notice it. So when I shot the gun, the bullet ripped the pillow apart. There's all these feathers in it. And so, you know, I was a little embarrassed, and I stood up after I shot, and I looked over at Jim, and I said, Jim, are you okay? He said, yeah, I'm okay. And I noticed he had feathers in his hair, he had feathers in his face, he had feathers on his clothes. But the really classic thing about this, which makes it a Jim Theiler story, is a bunch of those feathers that landed right here where he was breathing, and he couldn't breathe. So I said, well, Jim, do you think I ought to take another shot? And he looks up at me and he goes, he says, no, I think you've shot enough for one day. So we piled all the stuff in the car. That was one of my classics. The second story I want to share, and it's of course it's another hunting story, but he and I were up in Colmado, and we were going on a late season cow hunt, and that's generally in December. And it was miserably cold up there, and there was like 7 or 8 inches of snow on the ground. And so we were walking into this place that we always like to hunt, and we were sitting looking at this little canyon, see if there was anything out there moving. And pretty soon Jim tells me that you gotta go to the bathroom. But he told me he was going to take a dump. So I said, okay, go ahead. I'm going to look out over the canyon. You go ahead and do what you're going to do. So I'm sitting there watching, and he walks 20 or so feet down the trail, and he gets behind a tree, and he's down there for about 10 or 15 minutes, and he comes back, and he says, well, did you see anything? And I said, no. And he said, well, you ready to go? And I said, yeah, I'm ready to go. So he said, I'll lead. I said, okay, that's great. So he's ahead of me, and he gets ahead of me about 15 feet. And I'm going to tell you, yeah, you already know where this is going. But he had hung the toilet paper that he used on the back of his blue jeans, and there was this 10-foot trail of toilet paper that he was pushing up this hill as he was going up. And I looked at him and I said, hey, Jim. And he says, what? And I pointed and I said, what is that? And in, classic Theiler style, he said, well, I knew I was going to have to go again, and I just wanted to get ready. And off we went up the mountain. I know there's probably a lot of people who want to speak, so I'll keep it pretty brief. But the third story I wanted to tell on Jim was not one that I was with him on, but it was one that happened before our friendship got started. And he was going up to Farmington, and he was going up with 3 other guys, and the rule was that everybody would bring something for dinner, and they cook it so that they didn't have to cook when they got up there. They could just warm it up and eat it. So Jim decides he's going to make stew, and he fixes this, with potatoes and the carrots and the meat and the celery and all that kind of stuff, and he puts it in this big old pot, and he gets finished, and he loads his gear up and puts it in the back of the pickup truck, and he puts the pot back there. He drives up to Farmington, gets up to hunting camp, and he meets those guys up there. And then, they decided they were going to split up for the first day so they could see if they could find where the deer were. And so everybody got in their own truck. Well, Jim unloaded his pickup truck where he had all his equipment, put the tailgate back up on the truck, and down the road he goes. Apparently what had happened is when he got into camp, he was so excited about going hunting, he forgot to take that pot of stew that he had made out of the back of the pickup truck. And I guess one too many bumps or one too many ruts, and that pot had tipped over, and all of this stew was over the back of this truck. Now, I'm going to tell you, if you look in a guy's pickup truck bed, you don't know what you're going to find. You probably do, but I'm telling you, there was probably cigarette butts and dip cans and empty beer cans and all kinds of stuff in there, knowing Jim. But he looks over his shoulder and he notices all this stews in the back of that truck, and it's been, it's heading towards the tailgate. So he pulls over, he drops the tailgate, and he gets up in there, and on his hands on his knees, he starts navigating and pushing this stew back into the pot. True story. That's what he told me. But anyway, he's up there and he's scooping all of this stew down towards the tailgate and putting it back in the pot. And believe it or not, that's what they had that night for dinner. I don't know if he was able to segregate the things that were stew from what wasn't stew in there, but nobody complained. And the thing about Jim is that he's the guy that usually did the cooking when we were hunting together. And I'm telling you, every time he told me he brought something from home, I had this vision of mystery meat and everything else that he's a great guy. When I was driving, I'm from Roswell, by the way, and when my wife and I were driving up here, I spent some time thinking about what I wanted to say that would really typify this friend of mine for 40 years. Something that was inherent in his life that really brought out the quality of who Jim Theiler was. And see, it didn't matter whether you were one of his kids and you were a little short on tuition. You know, he was there to help. Right, James?
That's right.
Yeah. It didn't matter whether you were some family member that took their family up to Oregon and they blew an engine in their car. Jim was the guy that rebuilt the motor and put it in the back of his truck and hauled it up there and took one motor out and put the good motor in so they could get back home. You know, it didn't matter if you, it didn't matter if you were that crazy old lady across the street that nobody could get along with, that, you know, would go over and he would work on her house and he'd work on her car. And it, you know, it really didn't matter if you were his hunting partner and you got turned around one night and you spent the night out in the woods. He stayed up all night long waiting for me. So those are the things that, you know, that I really remember about Jim. But the one thing that really stuck with me, that made me realize what I'm about to say is happened about 20 years ago. And Jim would always wait for me to come back from a business trip. I traveled a lot during business, and I was coming back from Arizona, and just before we were to submit the applications for hunting, you know, I'd pull in there and we'd talk about the units we wanted to hunt, what animals we wanted to go after, and you know, those kind of things. And so, you know, he was so trusting. You know, he didn't understand a computer, but still he would write all his credit card information down on a piece of paper and he'd hand it to me and he'd sign the application. He'd say, okay, take this back to Roswell, fill it out, and you know, submit it so that we don't get rejected because the application was filled out wrong or there was some information missing. But as we got done filling out the application and we were sitting around talking, he said, wait a minute, I got something for you. I said, okay, that's great. So we went in the back room and he came out with a couple of shirts. And these shirts were brand new. They still had the Cabela tags on them and stuff. And he said, I can't wear these shirts, they're too big for me. Well, I said, Jim, let's just send them back in and you can get a refund or you can get an exchange or a credit or something. And he said, no. I said, I want you to have these shirts. So again, see, it didn't matter. Jim was always one of those guys that would give you the shirt off his back. I mean, I know that's kind of an analogy and it's kind of a simile, but at the same time, it's the truth about my friend Jim. You know, I can have the memories of the toilet paper trail with Jim dragging on up in that snow, and you know, and that's fun. I can smile at that and remember. And I can remember about the feathers in his face and him blowing the feathers out so he could tell me no, I didn't need to shoot anymore. And I can remember, you know, the other things with this, you know, with the pot of stew all over the floorboard, thinking there's all those dip cans in there and cigarette butts. But you know, I think about it now and I go, yeah, I'd probably eat that stuff if you ate it. But the one thing that I'm going to remember about my friend is that he was the guy that would really, truly give you the shirt off his back. That's the memory that I'm going to hold on Jim. And again, I can think of those fun times that we've had hunting and getting turned around and the things we did. But you know, the one thing that is going to stick with me, and you know, I really hope that from what James said and maybe from what some other people are going to say, that Jim is really one of those guys that would give you the shirt off his back. And that really meant a lot to me, not just for me, but for all the people he helped. So with that, thank you very much.
Think about it, Larry. I want you to think about it. Thanks for having stew.
That story.
Thank you all for being here to honor and celebrate the life of my father. You know, when everybody's staring at you, it's a little hard to keep your emotions straight, but he was a good man. One of the things I most enjoyed about this process, unfortunately, is hearing those stories, hearing the memories, seeing new pictures that I'd never seen. The dadisms all week were huge. Those really certainly helped. I'd like to share something with you that I wrote, and it's kind of how I remember him best. Go for a drive. hear the purr of the engine, the hum of the tires, and maybe, just maybe, let the windows down so the wind can roll around in your hair. Give it a mile, maybe 2. But if you really want to stretch those road legs, you'll need to go more than 232. Go left, go right, north or south. It doesn't matter which way you go, just go. Once you're out there, out on that open sea of anywhere, you'll see where my pops found himself most at home. Moving, going, and ever exploring. He was one who didn't like to sit still. You could say I was born on the road. All the time spent going back and forth on 25, the countless miles that have passed from beneath my seat. Hitching rides from Brinkin, Maryland, and Andy and Laura from as far back as I can remember. By the time I turned 12, my pops had shown me almost half the country. I must admit it wasn't always glamorous. Sheer boredom a child can face while sitting in the middle of 2 grown men in an old blue truck with no AC. As I grew, the stick shift was 1 shift away from playing whack-a-mole to my knees and into my shins. Uncle Skip, he was our navigator. And there was always a new place to go, an old historical site to see. But somehow, some way, we always found time for a Tasty Freeze or a Dairy Queen. They would often joke that he bought the gas, Skip got the ice cream, and they came out even. We ate so much ice cream. When the music was on, it was an extensive catalog of 3 cassettes. And to this day, when Marty Robbins, Big Iron, or El Paso's playing, I'm instantly drawn back. Him humming Cool Water to me, it's not a memory we'll soon forget. It's true, both my parents showed me the love of the automobile, but it was he who gifted me the love of the road. I love to drive. As I look back on my time spent watching all those miles go by, I'm honored to have been by his side. I often find myself daydreaming of being out on that open stretch of road. Perfect day, no place or destination to go. And this is where I like to picture him out there, driving and free. Thank you.
The kids one time asked Jim and I to go have a bite to eat with them down on Minal. And Jim told me, you need to talk to Debbie. She'll tell you where the place is called and everything. Well, I misunderstood her. I thought she said they were going to the Pork and Pig rather than the Fork and Fig. And I turned to Jim and said, you know, and you make really good pork ribs. I don't think I want to go have pork somewhere else. So we didn't quite make it that day. But anyway, I appreciate everybody talking about the different stories. Some of them we probably can say verbatim. They didn't change much, but if they did change, it was kind of understandable. But he did, he just like these kids, his dad was bigger than life too. His dad was came down and became a Highline construction worker. And Jim told me one time he was walking home with some buddies, and sure enough, there he sees his dad up on the pole. And he says, look, that's my dad up there. And he yells at him, hi, Dad, hi, Dad. And he waves back, and the kids, I guess, were just amazed. They were very amazed. So on that note, I just wanted to say that Jim and I, going back, we shared very similar family histories in the fact that it really showed the power of love, family love. We both had parents and our siblings that left everything they knew in their home country, Kentucky, Chicago, Illinois, to move to the Southwest for one particular person's health. And during that time, they learned to make a new life for themselves, and they learned how to have fun, but also work hard. I never knew Jim to not be trustworthy, truthful, caring, and meek in his take on life. He could cipher things that challenged him and attack them with determination, whether it was work or play. And he was just really quick about thinking about it. But sometimes he would cipher late at night, he called it ciphering, about something that was just irking him, that he just couldn't get it right. Well, eventually, believe me, he got it right, because there would be things around the house that were easily 40 years old, and I would be thinking that, oh, maybe we can replace it. We'd usually get another 20 years out. He was always rejuvenated with time in nature's surroundings. I'm so glad that his children adapted that same love. We had many joyful times together, and many miles of country were covered. I just had to be sure, because I know it was a lot of miles, but I just had to be sure that it was 3,700 miles one way to Alaska. And I did a round trip with him, and then one time I went up, and then some people came back with him, and I flew home. And the amount of country that we saw was just incredible, and we had such a good time. And if you knew all of these catchy little sayings that you see around, you hopefully didn't miss out on a wonderful childhood he had, because he just had a great life. He turned it into the life that he wanted it to be. He never complained much about work, because it was a means to an end. Namely, you could go out and play. His life experiences were really a weapon to face the last years of his life. I like the story about him as a skinny preteen kid telling his dad he would work with a green horse and break that horse. The only problem was the horse was ornery as heck, and he bucked him off at the end of the field. So moaning and groaning, there's Jim Lane. His dad comes up and says, "Son, you gotta get back on that horse." There was more moaning and groaning. So Dad gets up on the horse. Here's Jim in one side of the field, and his dad in the other side of the field, both on the ground, moaning and groaning. I think that horse went on down the road after that. I cannot be more thankful to have shared my soulmate for the time that I had with him. I think his broken body finally caught up to his spirit, and he's resting in peace in God's arms. Thank you. Had an RV. This was years ago. No, had a camper. Right? Okay, anyway. He decided to build his own camper, which he did a great job at. And he's getting ready to take it out for a maiden run, and he takes it down to work and shows it off to his boss, Carl. This was the original boss. And Carl looks in that camper and kind of scrutinizes it and everything, and opens up the refrigerators. You did a pretty good job. Sees the cases of beer laying on the floor, opens the refrigerator, closes it, and he says, "Jim, yeah, you did a really good job. I just don't know what you're going to do with those 2 packs of bologna, though."
Go fishing quite often. And one day we went out and the fishing was real slow on the boat we were on. So there's only 3 salmon caught for 15 people. At the end of the day, we all hold out our bag and I'm at the end of the line. And they had what they called a meat hook on the big ship. It's a lure they hung over the side. He had caught about a 40-inch salmon. And somebody was gonna get that didn't catch one. I'm at the end of the line, I watch these people donating to the person carrying this fish down. Some of them give her $50 and 20s. I'm at the end of the line, she drops it in my bag. I couldn't believe it. But anyways, we got back up and they have a place to clean the fish. But the other boats that did really good and that was really busy. Jim said, let's just take it over to we'll put it on a table. We'll put a tablecloth down there. We did that and we laid that salmon down there and he's getting ready to cut off the head. And the old Eskimo lady come up. She's about 80 years old. Can I have the head? I make stew out of it. Stew? And Jim says, yeah. Here's the head right here where you normally cut. He cut down about 8 inches behind that. You should have seen that smile from that lady. Had no teeth, but it's still a pretty. We got drawn to go to White Sands. It's hard to draw that hunt. And when we got out there, Jim says, we're gonna have some fun in this hunt. I said, why? He says, don't tell them, but I put a scope on my muzzleloader, which is illegal as well. You know, a rifle was illegal. So we were walking along the side of the hill and he was walking where everybody down below could see us, and you see these game wardens. Pretty soon there's 2 of them, then there's 3 of them. They're all looking at that rifle, they thought. Pretty soon about 6 of them drive up the hill. And they stopped them and they said, do you know that it's illegal to hunt with a rifle on the White Sands? He says, this isn't a rifle, it's a muzzleloader. Let me see that. It's a muzzleloader. He just loved doing those things. They didn't do anything, but we had people calling her on the telephones for 5 minutes to everybody to make sure it was legal. And evidently it was, because they didn't arrest him. But he was sure funny. No, there's probably some more things, but I can't think of them all at the time. But if I do, I'll come back. Jim loved to hunt. We were hunting up north, and we had to go up this hill about 2 miles to get to the top of the hill. Wouldn't you know it, Jim shoots an elk up there. And it's a long ways down. And a guy come by and he's got a horse. And Jim's talking to him, can we put this elk in the back of that horse? And the guy, no, that horse won't let you do that. So they made what they call them a travis, where you put the sticks beside the horse and tie it all together. And we put all the meat on there and the horns and everything. And this guy's name, I think, was Henry. And Jim was walking down in front of us, and he was leading the horse. And unbeknown to him, when he turned that first corner, those things, we put them over the saddle horn and jabbed them right in the side. And all you could hear is, whoa, you SOB, whoa, you SOB. We get down to the corner. Here's a rifle laying here. Here's a broken horn over here. There's meat scattered everywhere. We learned that's not the way you do that. You're supposed to be up underneath them. But you know, you gotta have some fun.
To visit him, And I noticed when I walked in, he had this wristband on that says fall risk. And I knew that that meant he's not allowed to get up out of the bed by himself. He needed help to get up out of the bed. And we're sitting there talking for a little bit, and he goes, I think I need to go to the restroom. I said, well, let me call the nurse. Let me get the call button and call the nurse. He goes, no. He goes, watch this. Watch what? And I figured he was going to show me I can get up all by myself. Just watch. I'm like, no, Dad, you need help getting up out of bed. He's maneuvering out of the bed, and he puts his feet on the ground, and he stands up, and he sits back down, and as soon as he stood up, ear-piercing alarm went off all across the world. And I'm standing there watching him, and people are running in from everywhere. The nurses are all running in. And I'm just looking at them, and they're looking at me, and Dad's just sitting there on the bed. And the nurse is looking at me like I had incited this riot. And I just looked at her, and I said, I told him to not to. That's the way he was, just funny with his little.
Offices go forever. One time I remember, I guess we were around tomorrow home and she's getting bored, wants to get up. My dad was working down about a block away at one of the neighbor's houses. And they said, Skip, Jim, and myself down and stay with Dad. There's some room. So anyhow, we went down there, and I was about 5 years old then, and get a little closer to the house, and I have to urinate. So they told me, your neighbor's fence over here is electric fence. And one other time, my mother, my aunts were down at the house, sitting in the front room having cake, and I was still in the crib at that time. And kept noticing Jim going up back room. And so Mom, I go check her. She goes in there, there's icing all over my face, all over my head, all over myself, all over the crib. And what the hell are you doing, Jim? They just said, baby, you like cake.
So I'm third grandson for Jim, and my family, we grew up in Chauvin, so Jim and Laurie would come and visit us. And I remember this was one instance where, growing up, my mom was very strict about it. Can't do this, can't do that, can't do this. So one thing was that we couldn't have any cereal that had a serving size of 10 grams of sugar or more, which is pretty much Kix or cornflakes. So Jim and Laurie came up, and I remember the next morning we were getting ready for cereal. I'm like, oh great, Kix, this is great. So Grandpa just comes on over, and I see him, gets a bowl, and he fills it up, puts the milk in, and he goes over, instead of coming to sit down with us, he goes over to the side of the corner of the countertop where the sugar is. Opens up the sugar, gets the spoon, just drizzles it all over, and I'm just there like, you can do that? Needless to say, it was after that trip, we then were able to eat pretty much whatever we wanted. Between that and then another story, which Dan was there for that one. We actually over for Becky's wedding, and afterwards we're young kids, and we're like, oh, we're gonna go out go-karting. It's 11 o'clock at night. We're already up late. This is amazing. I tried helium for the first time on a balloon. It was so much fun. So riding this high, I'm just like really enjoying life. And we get to the go-kart track, and it's like, oh yeah, Grandpa's a racer. I want to be a racer too. Let's have fun. So we did 2 races, and there was one. The first race, there was like this real punk kid, like just running into everybody. You just say he got kicked off the track. And so when we come back in, we're all just like super smiling. And this must have been, I think, like November, December, somewhere around there. And my mom's looking at us like, you guys must have had a really good time. We're like, well, we're kind of frozen like this. And I remember just those, like, that memory of, like, that was like, sharing, like, the pastime, like, moving down the line. Sorry. Another one. I must have been a freshman in college doing, like, an internship. And I had a lunch break, and it was, like, middle of the week. And Mom's working, I was close to where we were, so I actually had like a microwave lunch, and so went over to Grandpa's house, and he's like, "You want a beer?" And I'm like, And I'm like, yeah, sure. I'm trying to keep going. Like, no, I'm not 21. Let's go for this. And he comes back, and it's like Kirkland. I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm getting married. And obviously now being an adult and realizing Kirkland is just water, basically. You knew more about it, but like, like through the interactions, it's like the things that we've kind of all resulted, like with all these stories, that the thing that he taught, like I think all of us the most, that was just the simple things of life that really tie us like all together and just like share these stories, and we love them so much, and having that, like that's what we can carry down as we go further through, like the circle of life, giving him another great grandchild, not another great grandchild, but great grandchild, fantastic great grandchild. So just sharing those moments and hearing these stories, like we've all kind of said, has been like the best part about this experience, which sounds horrible to say, but if it wasn't for him, we all wouldn't be here today. And that's kind of what I feel like carries on through all of us. And like, we'll tell these stories when we're older, about, all these fun stories. Like, I never knew he actually won a race before. I have trophies. That's exciting. I get to now tell all my friends that, yeah, I didn't actually won races and things like that too. So hearing these stories and sharing them and just passing them along, I think that's the best part, is that, like you kind of said, it's that Theiler charisma that's kind of pushed on to more different families, different last names, different generations now, and it's going to just keep going. And he always said, one of his isms was that it doesn't matter how life goes, it could always be worse. And I have been blessed, and in turn, I think we were all blessed to have him. So, thank you all.